continue. So I'm recording this and then I'll post it up after so you can go back through it. Another person. And so, but it's really, you get the most out of it if you follow along. And so grab something, Kat, we'll let you know what sort of materials would be best, but pretty much whatever you have to work with would be good. If you have some questions as you're going along, you can either, there is a raise your hand feature in here, or use just the text and let us know that you would like to ask a question. All right, at that, I will put it over to you, Kat. Thanks so much.
Well, hello. Thank you, Susan. This is sort of my first official teaching a drawing class on Zoom. I've been having a gazillion meetings of late. So bear with me, but it should be fun. And I'm going to be using today is charcoal and erasers, but really, I mean, it's the principle of the drawing with light and shadow that I'm going to be teaching you today. So kind of whatever materials you have will work, but ideally, if you have charcoal and some erasers and maybe a pair of scissors, because we're going to be cutting the erasers to make some sharp edges, that would be great. So just an introduction to me, I'm a working artist, so I do a lot of artwork as my profession and a lot of writing. But my bread and butter work, or the way that I pay my bills, is to work with youth of all ages, I call them, because it's basically the heart of my work is try to engage people with the youthful heart regarding art and engagement. So I run a filmmaking program that has now gone virtual as well, as most programs have done. So if anybody would like any information, I'm going to tell you about that program at the end of this session. And my heart piece is to use creative engagement, meaning art, to really build connection, but also to deal with anxiety around our everyday lives, and using art to just engage. And it also helps a lot with learning. So I do a lot of mind mapping and all sorts of things. So, but today I'm going to be teaching you the principles of sort of drawing with light and shadow using a technique that I've learned over the years. And then you can just follow along as you need. And then you can, I guess, text. I'll try to check in on that chat set, or Susan can yell at me to slow down or whatever. But what we'll be covering today, first of all, is how to draw a three-dimensional kind of looking eye. And basically, it's one of the simplest techniques that I can teach, but it does, as you can see, have a pretty powerful result. So that's the first lesson we're going to be doing, and I'm going to take you step by step through this sort of simple way of rubbing the charcoal and creating light and shadow. And then that will take us into drawing a portrait. So I'm actually going to use one of my favorite images, which is this little guy from Angela's Ashes. And the reason I'm using him, besides a very cool photo of a kid, is that it does reflect all the shadow and light work that we're going to be learning when we draw the eye. And then if we have time, I'll just introduce the last thing, which is using negative space to draw with eraser. And we'll touch on that at the end. And then you can kind of take that with you. And I believe Susan has sent you a lot of the images that I'll be using today. And she can also share my contact information in case you have any more questions. So there we go.
Hi, just so you guys know, if you go under Canvas this week, under the extra resources, you can download all of the images as you're working and following along. So the ones that Kat are showing are there for you, and they're also there for you to do the lab work.
Awesome. Okay. So this lighting should be good. You guys can see this okay? All right. So deep breath. So maybe I'll just look at the chat. How many here, I mean, you've been doing some lessons with Susan already, but how many here in this room today feel comfortable with drawing in general? You want to just answer like me, or yes, in the chat room if you're comfortable, or a thumbs up like Jason. Hello, Jason. A little bit. Jason's so technical with his thumbs up. Yeah. So some are a little bit, some are yes. A lot of you are awesome. Okay. So let's see. Let's grab, instead of, usually I'll sort of do, if I was in a regular classroom, we'd be having a bit longer time and doing a bunch of engagement stuff. But I think we're going to use the eyeball as our first lesson and get you right in there. So I did send a picture. This is on my iPad. This is like a very generic classic Google image of an eye that I'll be kind of using as a reference. And what you'll see with the principle of the eye, take a look at how the lower lid in a typical lighting session, it really depends on the room that you're in, if you're outside, inside, like, note that the lower eyelid is much brighter and lit than that upper eyelid. So that's what we're going to be focusing on, is looking at the differences in the dark and light areas of the eye as we slowly build it. And we're going to take it step by step. So I'm going to all right, I'm going to put this up here as a reference. All right, so I'll be using charcoal. If you're using something else, you can kind of just work with it and maybe make notes. But the first thing I'm going to do is only focus on the upper eyelid, only the upper eyelid. And so I'm just going to draw a simple curve shape using my charcoal. That's it. I'm going to put this a lot closer. There we go. So all I'm doing is focusing on the upper eyelid and drawing just a curve. Then I'm going to take a look at the iris and notice how, like when you're drawing an eye, we're going to do just a basic eye today, but the iris will sit in different locations of the eye depending on how the person is looking at you. Notice that this iris is tucked in underneath that upper eyelid. So we're just going to draw that iris tucked in beneath that upper eyelid. So now we have a very, very simple drawing of an upper eyelid and an eye. This easel, by the way, that I'm using, I'm glad to see, it's very weird, but it is my father's. I just realized it's from 1950. So that's a pretty old easel. It's from Norway. Pretty cool. All right, so we've got the upper eyelid and then just an iris underneath. And for now, that looks pretty boring and not very three-dimensional, but we're going to slowly build this up. I'm going to draw the pupil. I'll move this a little bit as I see in my screen that we need it just a little bit. There we go. That is better. I'm going to draw the pupil, the hole in the eye where the light comes in, right at the center. And because I'm using charcoal, my hands will get really dirty, which is a really good thing because I'm actually going to use my fingers quite a bit to draw with. I'm going to get my hands really, really nice and dirty. If you have felt pens, you still can get that principle. And I will send you a link on how to draw a simple owl using felt pens, which will cover exactly the same principles. But really what we're just doing is playing with what areas are a little bit darker, what areas are a little bit lighter. If you're using your felt pen, you can do scratchy things instead of shading. One thing that I do if I'm using felt pens and want that charcoal experience is dip my fingers in coffee, believe it or not, and then I just rub it. So now we have the upper eyelid, the iris, and the pupil, but not the lower eyelid. We're going to ignore that for now. We just want to focus on the lights and the darks. This particular eye, everybody's eye is a little bit different. You can see that fold, that upper eyelid fold. So I'm going to just draw another line right there, parallel to that first line. And at first, this is going to look very, very flat, but it takes a little bit to just start building up all this. Then I'm going to do that little tear duct in the corner, which I'm just going to do as sort of a backwards letter C right there. And at this point, it's still kind of a boring flat image, kind of almost like an Egyptian hieroglyph, but we're going to slowly start to build those shadows. So what I can do now is start to take a look at how that upper eyelid creates a shadow onto my eye underneath it. So I'm going to rub this. If you have a felt pen, you might want to use a lighter color, or you can just do cross hatches or dip your finger in coffee and do the same thing. I love when felt pens kind of get runny. But all I did was rub my charcoal and let the shadow naturally fall onto the eyelid, to the eyeball underneath. Then I'm still going to use sort of my dirty fingers, not clean them as I'm going because they're great tools, is I'm going to pull out this iris. The iris, if you ever looked at an iris opening, closing, it kind of is this beautiful muscle that opens and closes. I'm going to do, using my pinky finger, I'm going to pull charcoal into the eye, almost like a starburst. And it gives this quick illusion of that circular muscle movement that an iris does. And all it is just a simple starburst using my dirty fingers. Then I'm going to rub, because it's a fleshy thing, when I do a lot of portraits, and when I'm doing humans, I do like to make things a little bit sort of softer and blurrier, just to make it fleshy looking. So I'm just going to run my finger along that iris outline too. So we're building up this sort of dirty areas here. We've got the pupil in the center. I pulled it out, the starburst. I pulled that shadow onto the bottom, and I did that iris line right there. So far it still feels a bit flat. So one thing that happens with the eye, move this a little bit, is the reason that artists or in art school you learn anatomy is because you want to do, when you're drawing something that even like a house, even any animal, you want to know what's going on underneath. So what is the skeleton, what's going on underneath. And so with an eye, this is not an almond underneath that eyelid, it's actually an eyeball. And so to create this spherical shading that happens on the eyeball, all I do is run my dirty fingers and draw that eyeball underneath the flesh. And as I do this, the corners of the eyes get this beautiful spherical shading. It's pretty amazing because all I'm doing is an eyeball underneath all that fleshy eyelid fold. But you'll notice that as I do this, how spherical that shading becomes in the corners of the eye, the inner and outer corners of the eye. So already that 3-dimension kind of thing is starting to happen. And now I'm going to take my charcoal again and emphasize what's happening in the corners of the eye. I'm going to overemphasize it a bit. So in the outer corner of the eye, I'm going to follow along, draw a little triangle of charcoal to add some extra material. And then I'm going to overemphasize that sphere right there in the corner. So you start to see that eyeball sphere appearing underneath there. Now, sometimes when you look at somebody, you can actually see that that little area where you can kind of see into the eye if you look at somebody closely. If they're really dehydrated, it's a good sign, like to see that. If you can overly see into their eye what's going on in that sphere, you got to tell them to get some water in them. That's my tip. Now in the inner corner of the eye, we still have that tear duct there. So I'm going to give myself a little bit more charcoal around the tear duct. And again, then rub that sort of curvy sphere right there. So I'm building grays and blacks and shading, and really looking at what is the shadow doing to help us build that form. And now we're going to get a little bit more aggressive with it. I'm going to go back to my upper eyelid line. And if I have charcoal that I'm using, I can go back and give it another good coat and then draw down that shadow even more. So you're getting really aggressive with overemphasizing that upper eyelid, and then pull the shadow down onto the iris. You can see that the iris gets tucked in underneath that eyelid. And then before we focus on that lower eyelid, we still haven't really done anything yet because we want that 3-dimension. I'm going to go back up here and draw some eyelashes. And when I draw the eyelashes, I don't do sort of the classic kid way, which is drawing the eyelashes straight up, because that makes it look a little bit plankton-like, a little bit cartoon-like. What I'm going to do is draw the eyelashes along the action line that things are growing. So the eyelash usually grows from, it kind of curves outward on your eye like this. So what I'm going to do is run my charcoal along the upper eyelid and then curve it out and up in the outer corner of the eye. So I'm just following the action line of the upper eyelid and then gently pulling those eyelashes outward and up. You can draw as many as you want, but you can see how it kind of makes it look like the eyelashes are curving and up, a little bit more realistic. So we're building that upper eyelid. Now I want to draw a very, very, very faint double line for the lower eyelid. The double line is to show the thickness of the skin on the lower eyelid and how it captures the light. So I'm just going gently with my charcoal and drawing that first line. And then gently with my charcoal, I'm drawing a double line. So I'm getting that additional double line there, but we can see how the upper eyelid looks darker. The lower eyelid is just capturing that light. And now if you're using charcoal, if you're using felt pen, again, you can use that coffee technique or you can do some scratchy, hatchy lines. But what I want to do now is get a little bit more body around the eye. So I'm going to rub my charcoal and do a bit more aggressiveness where that brow would start on the outer corner. Almost looks like you're putting on eyeshadow. And what's interesting too, as I build this up with, remember we had that eyeball still going on underneath there. You can see how it's the eyeball underneath your eye that's creating that bag under your eye, that curved bag when you're really tired. You get those bags under your eyes, the shadows under your eyes, that's running along that eyeball. So you can see how this is a big circle. There's a circle here, and you just put some flesh on top of it. So that's looking pretty good, but now I want to make it interesting. So this is a 3D eye, but it doesn't have life in it yet. And a really simple technique for when you're drawing any eye is to put in a little sparkle, a little highlight in the eye. In cartoon land, they do that a lot. If you really pay attention to cartoons, often the pupil will have a little white dot. And if the cartoon character is tearing up, they put more dots, white dots, to make it look like a wet eye. What I'm going to do, if you have been using felt pen, if you have white paint, you can put a little white dot in the eye. What I'm doing, since I'm using charcoal, is I'm going to use an eraser. And what I did with the eraser was actually cut it. I cut through a lot of my erasers. And the reason I'm doing that is I get these little sharp corners. And they're great drawing tools. So now we're going to not use the eraser to fix mistakes. We're going to use the eraser to draw with. And so the first thing I'm going to do is pull out a highlight in the eye here. And just grab a little bit of that charcoal and remove it. So you get a little bit more of a shine. I'm going to do a little bit of a shine if my eye is a bit messy with my charcoal, which is a good sign. I'm going to pull out a little bit of light on that eye right there. I'm going to add a little bit of white in the tear duct to show that it's a little bit wet. And then I'm going to pull a little bit of light out of that lower eyelid. And to get a little bit of extra pizzazz in the eyelashes, I'm going to use my eraser, and grab one that's a little bit sharper, and draw with my eraser some white eyelashes to really pull out some shine of those. If you're using felt pens, you can just use a lighter color or something to build those forms. It's really fun to play with felts and to see how they react. Some felts are water soluble, so you can really use them almost like watercolor. But for now with this charcoal, I'm just using the eraser to pull out the light and just adding little areas of really cool pizzazz. And if you don't like what you did, you can always just rub it out and then add it again. Now I've noticed with my portrait drawing that a really cool technique to do for the iris and to give some life and shine to the portrait is to actually pull light out of that lower iris part there and let that bleed onto the lower eye. And it just gives that sort of extra little life there. You can also pull little white highlights in the iris to really emphasize that beautiful eye. So there you go. Let me just pull this a little bit closer. And there is our principle of the 3D eye. There you go.
I think it worked really well. It was really easy to see the image, and I say we have it recorded so everyone can go back to it. And yeah, it worked. It was good. Thank you for.
Oh, cool. Oh, awesome.
Anyone else was following along?
Coffee here. That looks like coffee. Yes.
How it worked. That is cool. Yeah. It's a great example of what she was suggesting. We have marker and coffee.
Yeah. I know. And then how often have I drank my coffee after the whoopsie? But
there you are. You're like, okay, I'm good. Bit of marker never killed anyone.
So basically that is what it's really is about, is sculpting. Like you're almost sculpting. And that's why I like to use my hands a lot. Even if I'm using very fine felt pens, I do tend to get in there and mess it up with my fingers. That's just my technique. So
nice. All right. Good, nice. Everyone, anybody have anything they want to share? You can use, if you do, we can see it on, I'm going to turn mine too. Nobody's willing to share the video. That's okay.
All right. We can always share at the end and do like a Zoom team.
Yeah, they're going to, everyone just do your lab today is to recreate each one of these drawings. And so you go back to the video and then the reference images are there. And then for your lab, you're going to be doing this. And so I'll send you some examples when they're done so you can see how they did.
Fantastic.
All right.
Great. Okay, so we may as well dive right into the next drawing. And that is using this little guy, but I'm going to take you step by step. So if you don't have the reference drawing, don't worry, because we're going to do sort of a follow me exercise. And again, if you have felt pens or crayons, I suggest that you use the lightest color first as we build sort of guidelines underneath. We're going to sort of slowly build up this guy's face, and then we're going to use charcoal to sculpt in the form. So I'm going to grab a lighter color. Oh, I do have one here. I'm just going to use a little bit of a dry red pastel, but if you're using felt pens, or if you have like Crayola felt pens, then just use a lighter color first, and then we'll build up with it after. If you're using charcoal, go really lightly with your fingers initially, and then we'll build that up. Oh my goodness, I feel so professional. Okay, there we go. I'm shocked that my cat assistant hasn't showed up yet. So classic Zoom. All right, so with this little guy, I want to take a really close look at, first of all, where he sits in the space. So I'm going to clip him on the side here. And what I want to do first, and this is a good thing to do when you're doing any drawing, is to draw the frame that you're working in. The reason I do this, if I was doing it this big, which I should potentially do, I guess, if I'm doing it this big, I wouldn't just start on the paper. I tend to draw in the frame first. And it just tricks your brain into understanding the size that you're going to be working with. Okay. See here. And the reason I do this, yeah, it's a mind game, and you're telling your brain, okay, this is the area that I'm going to work with, and I'm going to work with this whole area. We tend to, especially if we're starting out as artists, to work a little bit too small. And I want to go as big. So say that you have this size sheet, just an 8.5 by 11, use the whole sheet to really give yourself as much space as you can. If you guys are using big sheets of newsprint today, use that whole thing, but draw a frame for the area that you're going to be working with. And then that way we can also compare it to where this little guy sits in space. Oh my God, I'm doing mirroring, so everything's backwards. Okay. So what I'm going to do first is take a look at where he sits in space. And I'm going to use my lighter charcoal, or actually my dry pastel, to do the guidelines underneath. And we're not going to be erasing those away. They'll just exist underneath. And I do have a lot of tutorials on my website that we can share that you can then go back and see how to do this kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do is focus on where he sits within this frame. So you can see where those shoulders sit and his head. And that's the first thing I'm going to focus on is, all right, his head is about here. I'm not going to be too attached to the outcome, but it's just to kind of basically put him there. And then his shoulders on his big, beautiful coat sit about here. So you can see that now I'm using that frame that I drew. I knew how big my area was, and I'm just setting him up in space here. The next thing I'm going to do is kind of start to block his facial features. He actually has very much the classic fundamental art school face, which is the full head is there and halfway down is the eye line. So if the full head is here, halfway down is his eye line. I'm just going to do a very gentle guideline right there. Between the eye line and the chin is the bottom of the nose. Between the bottom of the nose and the chin, halfway is the mouth. Classic art school kind of anatomy. So the whole head, halfway is the eye line. Halfway between the chin and the eye line is the nose line. Halfway between that is the mouth. Kind of predictable and weird. Now, everybody, of course, is completely different, but this is the basic principles just to get to drawing. And then the ears kind of appear between the bottom of the nose line and a little bit above the eye line. So this is a very cartoony version of him. But you can kind of see we're just building him up, giving ourselves lots of information. I quickly then, even though that's not going to be our main focus, but you see this shirt and the jacket, I quickly block in those things when I'm drawing, even if I might not finish those pieces when I'm drawing or sketching. I just block it in because sometimes an unfinished drawing can be a really cool thing. So I blocked in his shirt collar, his shirt, his little sweater underneath, and his coat there. So I'll just hold that up for a bit. So you don't have to worry that I'm going too fast or something, but all you want to do is just block in a few things underneath just to sort of give his head something to sit on. And then that way we have something to play with. So now that we have that, we can block in a few more things. I'm going to block in his beautiful big head of hair. Just a little bit there, just very cartoony, very quick. And then he's looking straight ahead at us. So let's just block in halfway there. So we've got something to play with. So we've got that facial structure. We've got the hair. And we've got, and you notice how I'm constantly feeling my drawings, and it is this really interesting way to continuously play with the whole piece. And you're always sort of touching it. Sometimes you can stop and really focus on one particular area, but to begin with, you're really laying it out. You're paying attention to the composition. And we're also sort of recreating the area around his head there as well. And you can see that that's an area that we've blocked out. So now let's lay out, because he's a kid, his eyes are a bit big compared to the rest of his face, and so we're going to exaggerate those a bit, and I'm just going to do a couple of ovals approximately where those eyes are going to go. And then I'll do a little ball approximately where his nose is going to go. So you can just start, he's slowly starting to come to life, although right now it is a very cartoony face. And then I'll just do a little oval where his mouth will be. So there's sort of a minimal representation of our young man there right now. So now what I'm going to do is go back to my charcoal and my black charcoal. And I'm going to take a look at, you see how his eyes are doing very similar to what we just drew, which is that his upper eyes are much darker than his lower eyelid. He does have some bags under his eyes, but his lower eyelids are in the light. So we're going to recreate the drawing exercise that we just did. And I'm going to focus on the two upper eyelids. And I'll run those along, sort of a little bit around the guidelines that I just did there. So I'm using my charcoal, and I'm just running my charcoal along where I would think the upper eyelids are compared to the nose here. And with his face, his eyebrows are a bit lower, and his eyelids are just, that fold on his eyelid just run along the top of his eye there. We don't see as much of a fold as we did with the other drawing. So all I did was run a little bit of a double line above the eye there. And for a while, this kid is going to look a little bit evil because we're going to get intense with the iris. So now I'm going to gently put in, just as we did with the first drawing, that iris tucked in underneath that upper eyelid line. And then I'll add the pupils, just like we did with the first drawing. And if you're using charcoal, you can now start to rub that upper eyelid and pull it down. You'll notice that if you're looking at somebody closely, the inner corners of your eyes pulls in that beautiful shadow at the nose bridge between the eyes. So I'm just using my charcoal to pull that shadow down. We're building up that form. His lower eyelid line is kind of, is tucked, it kind of touches the iris. So I'm going to use my dirty fingers and just pull in a lower eyelid line there. If I need more charcoal, I'll just rub the top, and I'm just going to gently do a double line underneath. So we're starting to build that eye a little bit. I'll come in and do the little tear ducts in the inner corners of the eye. And we can go back and just gently pull in some gray tone into the iris. And then you can, if you like, do that eyeball on each eye so we can start to even get more shading as we pull in those dark bags under his eyes there. But for now, we're not using the eraser yet to build up form. We're just slowly sort of building his face. His eyebrows, because he has a pretty serious expression, are quite low and close to his eye. So I'm just gonna run some gentle broken lines, as I call them, sketchy lines along the top of his eye, just to block in some eyebrows. And now we're gonna go down to his nose, and this is a really simple, at first he'll still look a little bit cartoony. It's when we get the eraser in there or some white highlights that it gets a little bit more lively. The lower nose, I'm gonna just draw, to begin with, I'm gonna add some charcoal on here just to draw with, and all I'm focusing on with the nose is drawing a couple of nostrils, the holes where the air comes in. And basically it's like two little backwards, like little raindrops or something, sideways raindrops. And then using those, I'm going to flesh out his nostrils by putting a couple of little fleshy semicircles on either side of the nostril. I'm using the charcoal to do that. If you're using felt pen, you can just draw in a couple of, it's kind of like brackets around the nose. And I'm just using the nostril charcoal to pull that in. And just like we did with the eye, where you found that the eyeball was underneath there, this nose has a nice round tip. And I'm just gonna, with my dirty fingers, do a little circle at the tip of the nose. And that circle at the tip of the nose gives a little highlight, but it starts to connect with the nose bridge and with the nostrils. We'll build that up a little bit darker in a bit, but we're just getting enough information on here. So all that was similar to where the eyeball was underneath the flesh. We have the tip of the nose and then these fleshy nostrils on either side. Super simple way to do a nose. You're just doing a circle. And now the mouth underneath, a classic thing too is that you'll notice that the upper lip is darker than the lower lip. The lower lip is capturing light. So what we're gonna do is decide how wide our mouth is gonna be, and his mouth is about as wide, a little bit wider than his nose. And I'm gonna do two little dots on either corner for the mouth. And I'm going to link that up with a very shallow letter M. So I'm just doing the lip line where the two lips meet. So I did a corner of the mouth there, corner of the mouth there, and then drew a very shallow letter M to connect the two. And then I'm gonna just focus on the upper lip. And the lip just becomes a slightly bigger letter M. And I'm just gonna color that in with my dirty fingers with a gray tone. So I'm just focusing on the upper lip. The lower lip, I'm not gonna draw in. I'm gonna focus on the shadow that's underneath. So you can see how by focusing on the shadow underneath and not coloring in the lower lip, you get a nice fleshy looking mouth. So what we've been doing is building up the eyes using the shadow there. We've been building up the nose using the sort of shadows around it. And then with the lip, you're just focusing on the light and dark areas as well. So we kind of have enough information for his face now. We want to get in later quickly with the eraser to make it more fancy pants. But what we're going to do now is quickly block in his head. So I'm going to take a look at the original and kind of decide, okay, how wide do I want his head there? I'm going to go in and really aggressively block in his temples. And again, if you pay attention to a human's face, they kind of angles out at the upper cheekbone. And then we go down to his chin. And because he's a kid, his chin just looks a little bit smaller than an adult. So I've just blocked in his head shape here. With the ears, I'm just going to decide, okay, how big were they? They always seem a bit bigger than you expect. Just gonna block them in a little bit. They look a little bit funny for a bit. And then just do a parallel curvy line on the inside to get a bit of a eerie kind, like an ear kind of image. And then a couple of little triangles just for where that sort of fleshy cartilage bit pulls out. And that's a pretty quick way to draw an ear. So all I did was a big curve, a little curve on the inside, and then a couple of little triangles. And now I'm going to quickly go up to the hair because we want to get in all our information so that we can make it fancy by the end. So now with if you have big black felt pen, you can use that. You know, just grab a big Sharpie or something. I'm going to grab my big charcoal and I'm going to really aggressively block in the way I'm kind of moving my charcoal the way that his hair might grow. You can make a sort of any hairdo that you want. He's got sort of the classic 1930s, 40s haircut, which is a bit bigger on the top and shaved along the side so it kind of comes in. And then I can rub my charcoal on that, just really fast, block in a whole bunch of hair. And then get it really nice and dirty. So once you get used to drawing, you can go really fast. You don't need to worry about making any mistakes because it's all just sort of fun accidents that happen in art. So there we go. We've blocked in his hair. And then what I'm going to do is just block in a little bit more of his coat here. We don't really want to focus on it too much, but just so that I get a bit of information, it can stay just as a line drawing for now. What I might want to do is just get a little bit of shadow underneath his chin that falls onto that shirt below. So all I did was kind of just go quickly over my guidelines that I had here and then block in however you want to make those clothes look, and then just block in some shadow, rub that underneath. So now we can get back to this young man's face. Let's see here, get that, okay. I want to get back to his iris and really make them nice and gray. I'm going to give myself a bunch of weird shading on the eye and then, on the face, and then I'm going to go back with my eraser, and that's when we kind of pick out really interesting items. Now I'm going to go and take a look at where the shadows fall, and the light seems to be coming from over here, and so therefore the right side of his face is going to be a bit more in the shade. So I'm going to give myself a bit of charcoal on the right side of his nose and on the right side of his cheek. Don't worry if you go too far. I had an art teacher that said if your whole sheet is covered in charcoal by the end, that's a good sign, even if you don't see any form. I'm going to give myself some nice shading and some curves right there around the chin to emphasize that round chin. And then so you're seeing that the shadow is falling more on the right side of his face. And now I'm going to pick up my eraser, if I've been using charcoal, and pick out some nice highlights. If you've been using felt pen and stuff and you happen to have white acrylic paint, you can always do a little white dot over his pupil. So I have so for those that are using charcoal, I'm picking up an eraser that I've cut again to make some nice sharp corners. And I'm going to start to pull out some light. I'm going to pull out some light. This is where you can start to just play. Pull out some light from the tear ducts. I'm going to run the eraser along the lower eyelid and pull it right up to underneath the iris. I want that lower eyelid to look like it's capturing light. I'm going to do just like we did with our first drawing. I'm going to pull out a little highlight in the iris. That highlight in the iris makes his eye look wet and more alive as a result. I can pull out a couple of little white highlights in the iris as well, in that starburst pattern around the pupil. We can pull out some nice light. If you're using charcoal and it's all nice and dirty, you can pull out some nice white light on his cheeks. And also along the bridge of his nose. And you can angle that up on his forehead so that forehead captures nice light there. So now I'm sort of going back along the areas that I rubbed with a whole bunch of charcoal and just pulling out some light areas. So you're just sculpting him out. Here I can see that because the light's coming from this direction, I just want a little bit more light on this side of his face. And the same with his lower lip. I want to pull some, if you're using white acrylic, you can put some white little highlights on that. But I want to pull some light with my eraser around that lower lip and around the chin. So I'm just sort of playing with areas of light and dark. A good technique is to squint your eye at the original, and you can see where there's more areas of light and dark. And then let's pull some light, just like I did with that first one, onto the cheek underneath that lower eyelid, just to make him a little bit more alive looking. And then we can pull some light right at the eyebrow here. So it's really a fun, quick way. And then now what I tend to do is get in there and get into the hair and draw some really aggressive little highlights in the hair too. So you're kind of giving some nice texture in the hair. I'm going to pull a little line around his face just to bring that face forward. And I'm using my eraser to do that. Again, with a felt pen, you can really have a lot of fun with just trying different colors. What I did with the shirt is do a really good technique is, say I want to get crazy with the shirt underneath, I can put in like a tartan pattern or something using my eraser or checker by just going with curves. So what you're doing is just playing around. Why charcoal is so fun to use drawing a human is because you can just sculpt and really have fun with it. Now, as a quick last thing, we might want to focus on what is the negative space around him. So I'm actually just going to take my red dry pastel and block in that negative space around him. And then this process, you could go on and on and on and on, but that is basically a very, very fast lesson in how to draw a portrait. What I might do then, I'm going to quickly, because I happen to be in my art studio, I'm going to grab some white highlight to show you what I mean. So really good, anytime you're drawing an eyeball, like for an animal and stuff, is to take some white acrylic paint, a sharp pencil, dip it in, and do a couple of white dots in that eye. And then that just brings it, even if you're using felt pen, anything, and it just gives that extra little sparkle to the eye. There you go. That was the portrait.
Thank you, Kat. It was amazing. I love it. All
That's
right.
a lesson. 2 years of art school. Yeah.
All right. And so I'm going to